All right. Dropping videos back to back to back to back to back. Today, or this video more so, we're going to discuss experts. I've had my arguments, even though I've been for 2 weeks researching the hell out of this, as well as taking information from people who deem themselves as experts, or not necessarily deeming themselves as experts, or actual experts, if there is to be one when it comes to this particular subject. But when I say it, there are people that push back because their experts think that let's say, mass lockdown is the solution. And because they want to work towards that solution as an active solution, they're scared, understandably so. They feel any pushback on that is detrimental because their experts maybe disagree with that. And this is such an odd subject because, not an odd subject, but it's like many others. We know that there are experts that are on different sides of this. So the fact that people act like there's this unanimous expertise here is silly because that doesn't exist. It doesn't. It doesn't exist. Not on this subject. You can find people that are like on the complete opposite end of it. They say there should have never been a shutdown. I talked about this in my last stream. Who with what is his name? With Kowski, he was like, "Hey, this should have, like other respiratory diseases, should have ran its course. We should have quarantined the old and the sick and let the kids and everybody," he was talking about basically his herd immunity. They should have been passing it along each other. And then after maybe a month span, people would have been able to get in contact with them again. That's what he said. However, experts are on different sides of this. Today, we're going to talk, we're going to watch the video together. Great piece that came out about a week and some change ago, actually maybe 2 weeks ago, more like. And it's Dr. John Ioannidis of Stanford University. He is what you would deem as an expert in his field. He's a physician, he's a scientist, and he's talked so much about this particular subject. So if you don't trust me, you want to trust the epidemiologist, here we go. But you may have saw this article that he wrote, if this is going to ever pop up. And he wrote this article, and he was talking about how fiasco in the making is what he called this. He said, as the Modelo virus pandemic takes hold, we are making decisions without reliable data. And this is what he's basically saying in this is that, look, we're making sweeping regulations and, making decisions that are impacting people's lives, and the data isn't even complete. And he's made arguments about this stuff before, clinical research and all this stuff. But nonetheless, that's the position that he had. That's more so what he was writing. He was like, look, we don't actually know, yet we're making these decisions based on this incomplete data. Now, in this piece, he's talking about this and how it's impacting. There's some things, some gems here that I want to pick up on in terms of what he talks about, if I can kind of speed through it.
Just something that has arisen very fast and has caught us off guard in a way.
All right, hold on.
Even embedded in the title.
So COVID-19 has been called the pandemic of the century. It's one in a century pandemic, and clearly in terms of what we see and what we hear and the mobilization and all the news and all the deaths that we witness, clearly it is a major threat, or I would say a threat with unknown potential in terms of its eventual impact.
So let's be clear here. He just said unknown potential, and that's important when we talk about experts and we make these decisions that are impacting people's lives, even from an economic standpoint, which he's going to talk about here in a little bit, right? It's so odd that people, for whatever reason, think that they have just concrete evidence across the board. They know exactly who's been infected. They know how they're being infected, how many people, and this is the proper solution. And that's just simply not the case. Even he's saying, he does this for a living. Even he's saying, like, dude, this is uncertain. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding this, but he'll continue.
At the same time, I call this as possibly being once in a century evidence fiasco, because we are dealing with such an unknown and uncharacterized evolving threat with very limited data. Many of our actions are just based on gut feelings, trying to do the most, trying to do our best, but without knowing.
Almost like I've said that, I don't know, numerous times. I've even kind of worded it like that. And people just this whole do something thing, right? We have to do something, and it's based on what they feel is right, not necessarily what is conducive to actually solving anything.
There's some of them will lead to more harm than good.
Ain't that
Unless
something?
we do get reliable information, we may just continue doing whatever we do with the best intentions, but doing it just blindly.
Oh man,
What can we actually say about the rate of contagion and the lethality of COVID-19 at this point? Is it as bad as the WHO originally said, 3.4% death rate? Can we say that with any firmness? Are we sure the death rate is worse than that of the seasonal flu, etc.? Can you just talk about what we can actually know about it?
So this is a major debate, and data are evolving on an hourly basis. So I will tell you what we know as of now, but it may change very quickly. The WHO indeed released an estimate of a case fatality rate of 3.4%, which at the time of the release earlier in March, it was based on the number of people who had died as the nominator and the number of people who had documented infections as the denominator. This is a crude estimate, and it largely depends on our ability to capture infections that are in the denominator. The number of deaths hopefully is captured with more accuracy, even though even for that number there can be some debate. For example, whether these deaths are by SARS-CoV-2 or with SARS-CoV-2, or also whether some deaths are missed, or whether some people who are infected now may die later, and we have not captured these deaths yet.
And that's important because people, for whatever reason, think that can't be the case. And I think one part was particularly interesting when he's saying documenting deaths as if they were, just because the person has it doesn't mean that what particularly caused the death. And if they're being included in the deaths, it's making the data, or making our ability to be able to assess this data very difficult, and it's very, very incomplete. And this is coming again from a guy that you would deem as an expert. So if you don't trust other people who are like, well, some of these deaths may be questionable, and you're like, no, that's what it is. This guy is saying, actually, we're still trying to figure that out.
But the bigger uncertainty is about the denominator, because based on what we know now, many people who are infected with this coronavirus, they present with very little, either no symptoms or mild, moderate symptoms that are very difficult to distinguish from the common cold and common flu. And many of them apparently would not present for asking for health care and for being tested. So
y'all got to understand, to hear him say it, we talked about this and we laughed and giggled about it, and pause it at a more appropriate spot. There we go. We laugh about it and say it's like, maybe if I put on a suit and like a red tie and I say the same thing, people will listen a little more. But because I'm wearing a fitted hat and t-shirts, it's you're stupid. Like, I'm picking the stuff up from the same guys that you claim that I should be paying attention to, right? And he just worded it the same way. And I'm interested to see what the comments are going to say now, because he said what I said in 2 videos that had a bunch of people jumping down my throat because dare I criticize what's going on.
Now is just the tip of the iceberg. And information from settings where we have more complete information.
And this is where he's about to start talking about that Diamond Princess cruise, as well as we'll talk about Iceland. I think I haven't done a video on it. I'm not sure.
That denominator suggests that the infection fatality rate is much, much lower than 3.4%. It is actually probably much lower compared to the 0.9% that is the main figure that went into some influential calculations by a wonderful team of researchers in Imperial College.
So he's talking about Imperial College doing making these models and stuff, and they're using like this 0.9% death rate. He's saying that it's probably, if we look at it in terms of the infection and how much we don't know, considering that there's people that are asymptomatic, people that have mild symptoms, and so these are really not going to be included in these numbers. The number actually would be much, much less than even that.
which probably overestimated the exact infection fatality risk.
What about something like swine flu from, years ago now, in 2010? So according to the CDC, it globally infected 1.4 billion people and killed between 151,700 and 575,400. And they had 60 million cases in the United States, 274,000 hospitalizations, and 12,500 deaths. And while they were frightening stories in the media at the time, there wasn't nearly this level of response. So what makes this different?
I think that each new virus is a different story. And it is justifiable to respond with alacrity and to not consider that this will be just yet another season with another situation like the swine flu or like what happened in 2009. In the past, most of these claims for major epidemics that would be devastating, eventually the projections and the predictions that were made early on were not validated. So the early estimates suggested that this would have a tremendous amount of mortality and cumulative number of deaths would be amazing. Eventually, the number of deaths were far more modest than
so
the
he's saying that basically, and that swine flu, and we didn't even make any really not adjustments like this, and he's saying that their models were wrong, or like the initial projections were incorrect, and they were overshooting it.
This doesn't mean that with the new coronavirus we will see the same story again. It could be that if not this one, maybe some other new pathogen in the future will reach that prediction of really exceeding by far what we commonly see every season with influenza. This makes for an argument that we need to be better prepared to get the most reliable information possible, because not only this year's outcomes are at stake, but also any other future situation where we may be meeting uncertainty. So it's very important that we get it right. It's very important for lives being at stake. It's very important for public health, for science, for really making sure that we have as accurate estimates as possible.
What would that entail? If you could just describe the testing protocol that would be necessary to get
this is where it's about to get juicy, y'all.
Ideally, you want to have a situation where everybody is being tested to see how many people are really infected, rather than just wait to see what is the number of people who come to your attention. Obviously, this may be difficult, especially in a situation where you have a bottleneck in the production of diagnostic tests, although that bottleneck hopefully is gradually relieved as we speak. Aggressive testing is important, but equally important, and probably even more important, is to have a random sample, a representative random sample of a population that can tell us by extrapolation what is the number of infected people in the general population. Which,
by the way, is not being done. I hate pausing in these awkward spots. It's not being done, as of me shooting this video, it's not being done at a mass level in America at all. At all. At all. Okay? So we don't know how many people have been affected in the past. We don't. How many people are infected that have mild symptoms or are completely asymptomatic? We have no idea. We have absolutely no idea. And as it stands right now, they're not really testing for that. So we don't know. But we can infer, at least right now, which he's talked about and he's going to talk about some more, that it would bring the death rate down, not up, if we looked at it from that look. And that's looking at it right now. It's not to say that, like he had mentioned, if somebody dies, if things may change, you know what I mean? But as it stands right now, that's simply, it would bring the death rate down if we included those infected, then bringing it up.
We do have some situations currently where we are approximating that number with some fair accuracy. One situation was actually a very early experience in the course of the pandemic. We have a cruise ship, Diamond Princess, where we had an outbreak of SARS-CoV-2. Many people got infected. This is a situation where you have a closed space. People cannot really go anywhere.
So it wasn't a planned thing, but yeah, for those that don't know, this did happen, where it was a breakout or outbreak on a cruise ship. So these guys kind of isolated, close quarters. It can do nothing but spread.
They live in very close quarters together for the duration of the cruise. So we had an infection rate of close to 20%. 19% of the passengers and crew got infected. And among those who were infected, as of now, 1% has died.
So of those that have been infected, he's saying that 1% of them have died so far. I'd say he's about to say that, you know, we don't have a complete recovery rate yet. But as it stands right now, only 1% of them have died.
It's possible that some more people may die later on. Not everyone has recovered yet. But this is a population where we pretty much know the outcomes of the infection on almost everyone who was on board. 1% is a figure that pertains to a population of mostly elderly people. The mean age of the passengers and crew was 58 years old, and the median, I believe, was close to 65. And we know now that there's a very strong age gradient. People who are older have a higher risk. People who are young have a much lower risk. Children, especially young children,
you're confirming
have zero or entirely negligible risk.
Oh, okay. And by the way, that's what I said in the first video that I the video about the chart that people jumped down my throat. It's literally what I just said, because even with the New York City numbers, which I believe he practices out of New York, yes, that's what it says, and he's just basically confirming that there's people that are younger that are extremely low risk or don't have risk at all when you look at like children and stuff like that. For the most part, that's not to say that there won't be outliers or anything of that nature, but as it stands right now with the evidence that we're given, the guys that are at higher risk are older people and people that are immunocompromised.
Try to adjust for the age difference between the passengers and the crew and the general population of a country like the U.S. The age and gender adjusted infection fatality rate in a U.S. population would be much, much lower than 1%. It may be 0.1, 0.2%. We need to have a lot of uncertainty around that estimate because only 7 deaths were recorded, so it's a very small sample size. And also, these people may not be the same as the general population in terms of what diseases they have, because we know that people who have severe diseases in their background have increased risk of serious outcomes, and including mortality. But allowing for these uncertainties, probably an estimate anywhere between 0.05 up to 1% may be more reasonable to consider as opposed to, let's say, 3.4%. There's a couple more settings where we have fairly unbiased data. One setting that has emerged in the last few days is data from Iceland. Iceland is a small country that really pays a lot of attention to science. They have a wonderful cohort. It's called DECODE, and they have set it up to measure genetic risk factors in the Icelandic population. They have decided to get volunteer samples to be tested. And
so they're doing volunteer-based sampling over in Iceland, very small country. And because it's a small country, you're going to get a higher percentage of their population in those countries with basically a higher percentage of people that are going to be tested as they mass test.
Do that for a number of days now. Obviously, it's not entirely random, but it comes as close to being random as possible. And until the last data that I saw, they had an infection rate in the population of 0.9%, which you extrapolate to 360,000 people in the Icelandic population. It turns out to be about 3,500 people being infected. And of those, only 1 fatality has occurred so far. We have 1 death, and there's also some people who have some severe symptoms. 1 death corresponds to 0.03% infection fatality rate. Obviously, if there's more deaths, that will go up. But if you compare that to seasonal influenza, which is 0.10%, it doesn't look that bad. It could actually be even less.
You mean to tell me that when people say that, or they compare it to, the more common flu, and I know people get so angry, oh, it's not the flu, bro, it's not the flu. Okay, I got you, but let's talk about the facts here. And he's saying if you go off of their, more mortality rate in terms of the number of people infected, because they're doing more randomized testing, it's bringing the numbers down, right? It's bringing the numbers down to where they do mimic that. But again, that goes back to when we talk about these death rates and stuff all around. That's the issue that we have here. Is that we're not even testing for that, for example, in America. But you can, when you look at Iceland or you look at other countries that are doing more mass forms of testing in this regards, and you can see that people are asymptomatic, they don't have it. And you're starting to include them in the infection mortality rates, is going to bring the actual death rate in that regards down.
Compared to seasonal influenza, although I would not be surprised if it's higher, but not really much higher. The last situation where we have an entire city being tested is the city of Vo in Italy, in a situation where we have the most dramatic events happening so far for the pandemic. That city had an early death of an elderly individual with underlying diseases, and they decided to test everyone in the population. So they tested 3,300 people, every single citizen, and they found an infection rate of about 3%. That was in the third week in February. So most likely in other communities in Italy where the ability to contain the virus was not very successful, it's very likely that the proportion of people infected continued to increase pretty rapidly. It would not be surprising if in some locations in Lombardy we have currently reached infection rates of 20 or even 30%, but this is still a bit speculative. If that's the case, then you need to correct the infection fatality rate or case fatality rate for Italy that seems to be very high by a very large factor. It could be a correction of 100, for example, that needs to be applied, and then the infection fatality rates would drop again close to the range of seasonal influenza.
Given the preference for randomized general samples.
Okay, so we got that done, right? I'm not going to, basically what he's saying is some of the things that I've said. I'm going to look at, there's some videos that I saw a buddy of mine clip from that same interview in which he actually talks about the economics of it all. And this is some of the similar things that I've said. And I'm going to play, I think this is one of them.
That was an exotic pathogen. Everybody thought...
Oh, yes, he's talking about Italy. And what we don't talk about for whatever reason with Italy is the fact that even when we discuss this whole flatten the curve
Italians
thing, right? It sounds like, or seems like it would make a little more sense to understand the medical resources. We don't want those to be exhausted. That's the whole point of the flatten the curve. You want to keep them below this deal. Okay, got you. Problem here is that, and it's easy to say this in retrospect, I guess. However, they were admitting Italy, and this is what he's going to discuss, admitting people that were utilizing these resources that even if they had no or mild symptoms, meaning that they had no reason to be there, but they're exhausting these. And you can understand as more people became infected, definitely with their older population, become infected, they need those resources, and those resources are not available because they've been exhausted by so many people that didn't actually need to be there because they were so hell bent on containing this, and it worked against them. And he sort of talks about this.
The first to be hit in Europe, and that was an exotic pathogen. Everybody thought that they had to do their best. So they said we need to admit these people to the hospital even if they had modest or not so severe symptoms. This resulted in a very bad decision making, and I think that this is something that every other setting that is hit by an epidemic wave needs to avoid. By admitting these mild or moderate cases very quickly, they became saturated, and when they started getting the severe cases, they just had no room for them. So Also, the hospital became heavily colonized with that new virus. This is a virus that can stay on surfaces. Many of their medical personnel got infected in that heavily infested environment. So there's a lot of factors that created like the perfect storm.
Yeah, in Italy.
I would be very careful to make inferences based on single case reports and anecdotes. I feel that every single patient has the dignity of his life, and every single patient is a different story. And we have.
All right, there's hold on. There's a couple of more that I want to show. There's two more. One where he really captured the economics of it all, but we're going to watch this one next.
Cases as heralded being something that I have never seen before. This is so horrible. That's the worst case of severe respiratory distress syndrome that I have seen. We are falling into a trap of sensationalism. I mean, can you imagine what would have happened if 60 million deaths that happen every year in this planet, we had a meter counting them one by one and having stories written for each one of them? It would be horrible. I mean, we have gone into a complete panic state, measuring so far a sizable number of deaths, but nothing close to the total cumulative mortality that we see both in this country and around this world. I think that that panic
it's
component.
important that you listen to what he just said. He's basically he's saying like we haven't even gotten there, but we're acting as if because the sensationalism where and he talked about this at the beginning of what he was saying, like sort of these outliers and people make it seem like it's just this over dramatic thing. And maybe for some it is. And that's what the media is always going to cover. Definitely if it's an outlier. You had a governor that even lied about it, a newborn, if I'm not mistaken, that in terms of them dying from this. So they're going to, go that route. But you got to put things into perspective, guys.
And that overemphasis of media attention is probably making things.
It probably said making things worse. One more, and this is one of my favorites from this whole entire interview, and I'll link it, of course, in the description box, is when which is a few doctors for whatever reason are doing, he considers the economic impact versus just not the health or the medical impact, which is for whatever reason people thinks that one predates the other or something like of that nature or is more important. And he's one, again, an expert in this field, but he's also taking that into consideration as something that legitimately needs to be thought about, right, when we consider these models and we consider this mass form of lockdowns.
I think that there's a very high chance that we are exaggerating. As we discussed, many of the features of this pandemic, of course, are serious, but I think that the estimates are exaggerated. And I think that there's a risk of really making some fundamental decisions about the structure of our civilization, of our society, of our future that may not be appropriate. I think that we have no clue how a society would work if you need to build it around a construct where everything is done from a distance. So there are some models that suggest that if you go down that path of basically lockdown, you may need to wait for 18 months. And I'm extremely worried about that scenario. I'm not sure that our world, our civilization could survive that. I think that there is not just millions of lives at stake, which is the pessimistic scenarios about SARS-CoV-2. It is billions of lives who might be at stake if we have to protract that for so long. And my plea is to get the best data because we have very serious decisions to make.
And basically, yeah, that's what he says. Look, so he's saying that we're looking at these consequences of a lockdown, these shutdown for these entire extended, long, indefinite, he said 18 months, but these indefinite amounts of time, and that time is 18 months. Like, that's not sustainable, right? Like, you're talking about, on one side, we were talking millions, but now we're talking billions of people. So I'm glad that he actually takes that into consideration. Now, what I do want to end with this, let's say this, because I showed you guys an actual expert who says basically everything that I'm saying. Not everything, but for the most part. appealing to authority when you comment on this, whether it be in a comment section or you're talking to a friend, appealing to authority is not an argument. Why? Because as I showed you, there's an expert here who is coming to his conclusion, which may be different and not proportionate to, let's say, these mass lockdowns and so forth. But another expert may say something different and come to a different conclusion as far as what he finds is necessary. So let's stick to their arguments. And yes, I'm obviously saying this from experience because, you get these weirdos that are in my chats or in my comments saying, you're not epidemiologist, you don't know, I'm not going to listen to you. Okay, fine, don't listen to me. Here's the appeal to authority that unfortunately I have to do because you only accept it coming from this guy when all I'm doing is looking at the information that's been provided and I'm analyzing it like that, and I'm looking to experts as well. It's not an argument. Let's stop appealing to authority. But like he says, we'll see, because as it stands, much like even with swine flu, as it stands, they may have exaggerated this, and this may be one of the biggest evidence fiascos of all time, considering that we responded in the way that we did. And if it is, we have to have that discussion, guys. I know it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's not like the government officials or the bureaucrats who, among us, all these countries, who make sure they pass these laws and shut everything down, no matter what the economic ramifications are. It's not like they're going to come out and say, "Hey, guys, we got this wrong." They're always worded as if, "Hey, man, if we didn't do this, look what would have happened." But we got to have that conversation, homie, because this was put out 2 weeks ago. So you had experts on this subject for a while now, already like, look, man, this looks to be severely exaggerative as it is right now. If it morphs into something else, we'll have that discussion then. But that's the problem with this, is that people are making these decisions based on this incomplete data. That is dangerous.